Enjoyed the presentation from Professor Roberts. We are going to start our afternoon with a panel on healthcare in Appalachia. Our speakers are Professor Hannah Hexgard from the University of South Dakota, Knudsen School of Law, Professor Elizabeth Van Nostrand from Temple, University Colleges of Public Health, Professor Amy Palumbo, also from Temple University College of Public Health, Professor Jessica Roberts from the University of Houston Law School, and of course, our very own Professor Valerie Blake. All five of these wonderful people have a robust background in health and healthcare law, and we are looking forward to hearing their thoughts on healthcare in Appalachia. I would also say, just so you know, never has one person been more intimidated and underqualified to stand next to this many brilliant people, and so be merciful to me, please, in the time we have ahead. If you have any questions, if time allows, we'll provide a time at the end for you to ask questions. So if you're thinking of them as you're going along, you might want to jot them down, and we will try to get to that point. But to move right along at this point, our first question I want to ask is, healthcare in rural areas, particularly in Appalachia, has historically been, or at least the perception is, behind in its nature to try to be current as in comparison to urban areas. First of all, I sort of want to know if that perception is in fact reality, and then what factors have played, do you believe, have played the role in that historical trend, if in fact you believe it to be so? And I'll let you choose who wants to.
I guess I will start by saying I think that my presentation earlier about Frontier Nursing Service highlighted a couple ways in that they were really leaders in healthcare. So I don't think it's anything systemic to Appalachia or something that has to be true, because you can certainly point to counter examples where Appalachia has been, in fact, a leader in healthcare provision over time.
I'd like to add, one of the issues with that question and with a bunch of research that I do is, how do you measure success? You know, how do you measure excellence in healthcare? Is it the amount of time that you get to spend with a healthcare provider? Is it state-of-the-art equipment? How do you measure excellence?
That's an interesting take on it, because in some of those areas I would probably make the assumption that we actually rank well in Appalachia. I mean...
Is it interpersonal connections, that your physician knows who you are and knows your family and takes the time to address your needs? And I would suggest in rural counties that might very well be the case.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the important things to unpack is it's not that rural communities have necessarily a kind of an antiquated healthcare system, so much as the health of the population tends to be poorer than the rest of the nation. So, you know, if you take almost every health outcome that you could measure, and you look at the 50 states, West Virginia tends to be in the bottom 5 for almost everything. Childhood vaccinations is one of the things that we actually we excel at, although I think we'll stay tuned and see if we keep that up. But you know, we tend to have poorer health outcomes in the state, and when you look at that issue, part of it is a swamped healthcare system, right, that can absorb that shock. A lot of it is social determinants of health that have led to a population that is ultimately sicker than the rest of the country. It's the kinds of jobs that people in West Virginia have. It's the lack of attainment of higher education. It's the housing. It's the infrastructure. It's the poverty. It's all of those things compounding, ultimately leading to this overall poor health, and a healthcare system in a rural community trying to combat that.
And I think that something that you said about childhood vaccines is really important, because West Virginia, you know, as I said in my talk, that West Virginia is one of a handful of states that don't allow for religious or philosophical exemptions to vaccine requirements. So I think that possibly could have something to do with it. And also, vaccines are free for kids. So, you know, the provision of free health care is very appealing to families that might not have the resources to expend on their children in other areas.
Yeah, I mean, that's such an important point to me. Public health is so critical for a state like ours, where it's not always clear that people will get the health care that they need when they need it. So prevention is often worth more of a cure in a state like this. And, you know, so something like childhood vaccine rates, I would hate to see us fall and no longer be one of the top states in terms of rates. I anticipate we may see some political changes happen there, though, in the future. Let's see.
I would guess that's a fair assessment. I want to make sure, Jessica, if there's at any point you want to jump in, I by no means want to ignore you being there. So, anything? No. Go ahead. I'm sorry, hold on, Jessica. We can see you're speaking. I can see you're unmuted, but we do not have volume. All right.
Oh, let's see what's happening here. It's been that kind of day. We should have volume. Can you go ahead and try to talk now?
Hi, does that work?
There we go.
Okay, so I was saying I can just use my little raise hand function here, if you guys can see my little yellow hand. If I have something to add, does that work? Can y'all? I'm assuming everybody can see it if you can see me, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, cool, perfect. So not for this question, but for the next one, I think I have something. But I'll let my colleagues go first, and I think I'll jump in. But I might have some thoughts on two, but I'll let other folks that are in person go first.
All right. Anyone else on? So we've been, in the first question, we sort of trying to get a sense of what the historical look back might be. Let's now leap way forward to a present day scenario. And having spent part of my life in the political and government environment, I have lived out my life wanting to be able to say this. I have a two-part question for you at this point. What impact has COVID-19 had on rural healthcare areas? Are any of those impacts specific to Appalachia or worse in Appalachia? And then the second part of that is, are the problems facing healthcare in Appalachian areas the same as before COVID-19, or have they in any way shifted during this time?
What an enormous question.
Yeah, I know.
Well,
let me break
so
it down
I-
again a little bit, and that is, are we seeing any differences related to COVID-19? And are those differences actually worsening the situation, or in any way are they possibly causing us to have to move into an era before we were maybe projecting we would?
Well, if my colleagues who are in person don't have thoughts, I can jump in and say a couple things about this question. I think, if that's okay. Does that work, y'all? Again, it's hard because I can't see people. So I think this is a question that people have had about the effects of the pandemic on all sorts of different health disparities. populations. I can, as far as the two-part question, I can speak less to the second part. But when we think about COVID-19 and its impact just generally on health disparities populations, it's obviously exacerbated existing problems. And at the beginning of the pandemic, I actually was talking to Professor Blake when people were outraged discovering, what that access map looks like, or discovering what some of these health outcomes for different populations look like. People were like, oh my God, we had no idea American healthcare was so bad, right? And we had no idea that American healthcare was so bad in these particular kinds of ways. Many of us that have been writing and thinking about these issues, this is not something that surprises us at all. So when we're thinking about the impact of the pandemic, on rural areas, what it's done, I think, and I can't speak to specific, rural populations in West Virginia or elsewhere, but, COVID-19 has exacerbated problems that we already had. And in some ways, maybe this is a positive thing because it's highlighted things, it's brought things to the surface. But if you go back and you look at that map that I showed, right, the fact that these populations have to travel farther to healthcare is a huge deal in the context of a pandemic where people can really bottom out very quickly because of the virus, right? So your access to emergency care is something that is a real issue, and that issue predated the pandemic. The pandemic made it worse. The pandemic made us maybe realize that we have all these different issues. And, this is something that is happening in Appalachia, right? People are having difficulty gaining access to healthcare because of institutions. We've also seen, ironically, maybe this in urban areas in the pandemic too, because of the nature of the healthcare system, a lot of hospitals and providers in lower income areas were closing. And so certain urban populations didn't have good access to care during the pandemic, which of course then took these problems we already had, like Professor Blake was saying, and just made them worse, right? Because you're working with a particular baseline. So, are they specific to Appalachia? I think, in a sense that any of these pre-existing issues are specific, I think so. And I really think it does go back, like Professor Blake was saying, to having, populations with lower relative health to start off with because of the social determinants, having this swamped system, and then layering a pandemic on top of all of these issues just made what was not great or bad worse. So hopefully that speaks to the question and maybe gets other folks going. I hope that was the right question to answer. But that's what I thought of when I read this.
Let me riff on that and add a few kind of specific examples, I think, that come in a West Virginia context. So in the health law land, we talk about diseases of despair. I don't know if you've heard that term before. It sounds very dark. It's the kinds of mortality and morbidity that are associated with mental health, with substance abuse, and they tend to be things that happen in much larger proportions in the state of West Virginia and in Appalachia than they do around the country. The pandemic, so predating the pandemic, these challenges were highly prevalent in West Virginia. After the pandemic, well, I guess we're still in the pandemic. Who am I kidding? So during the pandemic, what we saw statistically is that those issues have only increased. So take one data point of overdose death rates. Overdose death rates have been climbing nationwide during the pandemic, one of the highest spikes in West Virginia, in a state that already had higher overdose death rates than the rest of the nation. Another example, we have an incredibly swamped child abuse and child neglect system in the state. We already had incredibly high rates of that pre-pandemic. During the pandemic, police force have been saying that we've actually been seeing lower reports of child abuse, but they actually think that's a really bad thing. Because it's not that there's less child abuse, it's that there's child abuse going unreported and undetected. because the children aren't interacting with mandatory reporters. They're not coming into schools. They're not going to the doctor. They're not leaving their homes to be around the safe and secure adults who would let the system know that they're being abused and neglected. And so that system is seeing enormous increases, and also at the time sort of hidden rates of abuse that are going unmet and that we will be dealing with in the years to come, that will be exacerbated because they've been let go for a period of time. So, you know, there's always this saying in healthcare about how when some communities get the cold, others get the flu. That's always true of rural communities. They always sort of get the heavier brunt of these issues, and I expect that we're going to see sort of obvious health harms of the pandemic, but also longer range hidden things that reveal themselves in the next decade or more.
May I share something? So one of the, even though this study does not take place in West Virginia, I think that a lot of the findings are generalizable across the across the United States, including West Virginia. So I'm about halfway through a 4-year CDC-funded study that is looking at interventions individuals are given who are arrested for drug misuse, and trying to decide how they impact morbidity and mortality. So my study takes place in Indiana, also a very rural state, just like West Virginia, with a high rate of incarceration, just like West Virginia. And although our findings right now are preliminary, some have shown the effect of COVID on healthcare provision to incarcerated populations. And so, for example, in correctional facilities, some typical interventions that are given to people who are arrested for drug misuse are cognitive therapy, job training, anger management. These are some of the therapies that we are seeing that are actually given to folks. With respect to cognitive therapy, what does that involve? That involves either individual or group therapy, sitting down, right, with a therapist, talking things through while COVID happens. And so what? That goes away. Because they're no longer wanting these, you know, face-to-face interactions. Other people can use telehealth and get some sort of relief for mental health issues and substance use issues via internet, but if you're incarcerated, interestingly, in Indiana there is one privately run correctional facility, the rest are run by the state. The one institution that is privately run actually gave all of the inmates that were participating in behavioral and substance use programs tablets, you know, like little not tablets like this, but, you know, electronic tablets. And they were able to continue their cognitive therapy. But for most people who are incarcerated, that put a complete halt on the types of services they were provided. So that's one very negative impact that COVID has had on health outcomes.
And let me affirm what you're saying from a different angle. So here in West Virginia, I direct the West Virginia Access to Justice Commission program. And we actually ran into that very same information inside the state in that we have one area particularly focused on reentry programs. And people who were able to get to reentry before in a often much smoother process, still difficult, but smoother than during COVID, they couldn't meet the counseling requirements that they needed to be able to get released, and because they just weren't showing up. The people offering it weren't allowed in their building, so forth. So
I'll have to share our study's finding with you because
appreciate that. Yeah.
actually the control group in our study are folks who go to correctional facilities. Our experimental group are people who go to problem-solving courts, whether they're adult drug courts, mental health courts, veteran treatment courts, and the like. So we're comparing the interventions that are given to folks who go through those programs versus the interventions given to people who are incarcerated, and looking at EMS calls, emergency department presentations, death and rearrest.
Excellent, excellent. Anybody else want in?
I'll make a final comment, just kind of agreeing and supporting what all of my colleagues up here have said, but I do think that a lot of these, it's almost kind of two different impacts. There's the impact of, the infections themselves and the impact on the healthcare system, and then there's the impact of the interventions and the social isolation, the lack of educational and social services. And I think some of those, we're going to see like very similar effects, whether it's rural or urban communities, because, we are seeing, increased rates of, deaths of despair, also violent crimes kind of across the country. So, and I think it'll be interesting to see what communities, after these services were halted, can they, did that have a lasting impact? I mean, it did have a lasting impact, but how do we overcome that? On the flip side, we are still dealing with people getting sick. And, especially related to the work that we presented earlier, it's in the places where people are still hesitant to get vaccine, that's where we still risk the healthcare systems being overrun. And so, kind of as we try to claw our way out of this pandemic, it's those systems that kind of have the least slack that are also at risk of, kind of hitting a crisis point again, which, can have its own kind of reverberating effects. So.
Well, in the same spirit of this line of questioning, we talk about what COVID has put a light on, if you will. Some areas we've been able to address, some obviously we haven't. I think the one that jumps out at me most, or that I hear about most, is telemedicine. And that, of course, then closely links to rural access to internet service that is reliable. Any revelations from the panel on what you found in the midst of this, or?
It's lacking. I mean, and
Getting worse.
Yeah, and getting worse. That was the, in our trying to find, updated information on, what the services look like. And I think as our technology in general improves, that means you need more, and you need more bandwidth, right? You need better internet access. And if we're not going in that direction, somebody mentioned, is this just going to exacerbate the existing disparities? And I think that's a real concern.
I would also add that a lot of people in rural areas go to places like libraries to access the internet, which has two problems in the current landscape. First is a lot of those public places shut down because of COVID, and so people lost the only internet access they had. And second, many of those are not private. So you may be able to use the internet there successfully for a lot of things, but probably not for confidential health appointments or meeting with a lawyer or those sorts of things. So even when we do have internet available, kind of publicly provided, it's not always successful at the means that we're hoping to achieve.
And when you look, there was a survey done of West Virginians and how competent, it was a self-survey, how competent or competent they felt in using the internet. And not surprisingly, or I guess I was kind of surprised, the majority of people who answered said they either use the internet poorly or very poorly in West Virginia. So even the folks that have access to internet, broadband internet, around half of them don't feel comfortable surfing it or using it to access information. So that's also a problem.
So I have a thought too on the sort of the broadband issue, because it obviously quite clearly relates to tech. And I think that, that is something that is well understood, right? That the success of any health tech, and so now I'm going beyond these sort of consumer apps and, talking also about telehealth, telemedicine sort of concerns, and any ability to use tech as a bridge is obviously limited by these issues. And a while back, and I was just, I'm lucky that I'm at home and I can, look on the internet as I'm doing these things. A while back, the FCC, so not the FTC, but the Federal Communications Commission actually had what it called a Connect to Health Task Force. And I'm not sure if folks on the panel are aware of this, but this task force was really looking into the potential of broadband technology to improve health and address some of these disparities. But I think that, and rural communities were definitely on this list. But I think, unfortunately, and for obvious reasons, the task force stopped. The last list it had was in 2017. But the FCC was, at least at one point, interested in identifying areas where broadband was lacking, with the hope that having these priority lists would then allow the FCC to come in and improve the ability to use tech. So there was some acknowledgement, right, that we need to improve. That's a preliminary issue before we can use these technologies, if we really want to meaningfully use these technologies. So hopefully we'll have a Connect to Health task force in the FCC again at some point, or something similar, because these issues obviously did not get resolved.
Yeah, I mean, so much of the boom of telemedicine during the pandemic had to do with sort of deregulation to allow it to be accessed, right? So Medicare had certain restrictions in place where you couldn't provide these services, and they dropped a lot of their impediments to telehealth. There were all sorts of different, HIPAA, there were all sorts of HIPAA problems, other kinds of civil rights agency problems, and OCR said, we're gonna drop back the regulation of telehealth during the pandemic. And what I've sort of seen as things are leveling off is that rural communities, including West Virginia, the policymakers have said, hey, wait a minute, now we have telehealth, we've sort of experimented with it, it filled this gap we needed during the pandemic. We want to keep it, and we want to make sure that this kind of era of deregulation continues to allow telehealth to flourish. And so embedded in that is this concept that telehealth is a net good and a net necessary for rural communities. And I think in some ways that's right, but I think we do a disservice if we don't pay attention to these very real concerns about it. You can't deliver a baby by telehealth, certainly, and it doesn't get to some of the serious gaps of access to care that we witness in a state like this. And it also deflects from, if the problem is that people can't get access, telehealth is one solution to that, but we have to look at the other ways that you can meet people where they're at. So, do we need more expansive home health? Is that a way to kind of expand access to care that could be more impactful and doesn't run into some of these infrastructure problems with broadband and things like that? So, my worry a little bit is that telehealth is new, even though it's really not, but I guess for being, a decade or so old, it is new. It's kind of newer and sexier, right? And so we put our efforts into it, maybe while ignoring the other things that we might be able to do to expand access in a big, rural, hilly community.
Yeah, and I know I've already spoken, but I'll say one more thing, because I think that Professor Blake raises a great point. I think that a lot of the tech is an excellent complement to traditional healthcare, and it's not a substitute. And I think that that's an important thing to emphasize. It is not something where the tech is going to come in and just like fix everything, and that, if we all just had better telehealth. And it's interesting to hear y'all talk about West Virginia, because in Texas there was so much resistance to allowing telehealth, and we had to relax that, and many providers very much want to keep it, so that, because they saw some improvement, at least with certain people showing up to appointments and things. But yeah, the technology is always something that is a support and an aid and a complement, and and certainly not a perfect substitute, but not really a substitute at all.
All right. So just a bit longer on this whole access scenario. We sort of talked it through as it relates to internet access and telehealth. In the present era, COVID-related or not COVID-related, what else would you define as access issues to healthcare for rural Appalachia, possibly even rural America?
I guess I would briefly say a shortage of providers, right? I think that there need to be more providers and the systems need to get more people practicing medicine in rural areas.
Also, an expansion of roles. So, looking at, certain professions are regulated by the state, like what EMS person can do and what nurse practitioners, advanced registered nurses and midwives and clinical nurse specialists. And those are all regulated by law, physician assistants. If we could expand, perhaps, their scope of practice, that might fill in some of the gaps.
And along
I
those lines,
also, I just want to briefly say, transportation is also something that's important, right? Is that not just having the providers in the locations, but making sure that people have ways to get there. And in speaking about the pandemic, that was a huge issue for a lot of folks that really wanted to go get vaccinated and were qualified for being vaccinated, but couldn't actually get to the vaccination site to get the vaccine. And so I think that, it's not necessarily, you might not think that better transportation is a health issue, but it very much can be.
definitely. I think transportation, how close in proximity, the vaccine has these, very strict requirements on, keeping it at certain temperatures while it's, being stored and transport and both, when it gets to the site. And that's a lot of limitations, that we see globally for vaccine access. And I think even within the US, that's still relevant. And the other thing I was going to say is also, we've talked about substance abuse or, substance use disorders and mental health. And having providers available for that and working, maybe with more providers, somehow working to reduce the stigma associated with those things, I think will be an important component.
And there's some economic barriers also to access. If I want to go to the doctor, I go. My paycheck's still there. If I am a bartender and I have to leave my work to take my child to the doctor or to get myself a COVID shot, not so much. So these are also, we have to fill in the gaps with respect to economic disparities and allowing people the time to get the healthcare they need.
Oh, I so agree. We cannot separate healthcare and healthcare access from economic issues.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about West Virginia is it's actually one of the states with the lowest uninsurance rate. And that is because of the fact that we have one of the highest rates of Medicaid recipients in the nation. So, we have a large portion on our state employer plan. We have a very large portion of people on Medicaid. People, largely have access to health benefits in this state. But, do they have access to healthcare providers? Do they have access to providers who accept Medicaid? And do they have the time and the other socioeconomic resources to go and get the care when they need it? Those are the big problems for people here.
I would just follow up, particularly to Professor Haxgard's statement about providers. Of my 5 kids, one of my daughters is an occupational therapy manager. And she, in a conversation recently, she pointed out to me that her disturbance with the term frontline worker, because she said it implies that there's someone behind us. And right now there's no one behind us. And so she would tell you that's a very real concern, that they're scrambling to staff on a regular basis, let alone to have backup. Okay, let's try one more, and that is, before I turn this over, and you've got 7 whole minutes to answer this question. It should be easy. Going forward, what actions can be taken to improve healthcare in Appalachia? And in particular, because of where we are today, how can public health and the law work together to improve the current state of healthcare in Appalachia? As I said, take your time. You got 7 minutes.
I'm gonna filibuster the whole thing, no.
So I seem to be the one talking about education, so I guess I will start there with a quick answers. I think that the strategies in the education path and getting more providers basically boil down to 4 things, and I think all 4 of them are good and should continue. One is providing and supporting professional schools, so making sure there are schools available for nurse practitioners, PAs, MDs, right, everything that you might need. Another is, while students are in those schools, increase educational opportunities in rural areas that need providers. So make sure you're setting up internships, or you're paying for proctors to get people field placements in the areas where they need to go. There are targeted loan forgiveness programs or other stipends that should be targeted very specifically to areas that need services. We've done that for a very long time in the medical world, and it's certainly something that should continue. And then I think the last one is, of course, just direct support of healthcare facilities and making sure that the rural facilities have the dollars to hire and retain the staff that they need. So I guess that would be my, from the educational provider standpoint, part of the answer.
And if I could just dovetail off of that a little bit, we also need to be cognizant of educating our public health workforce, because about 14% of people who are in governmental public health actually have a public health background. And I'm not, Amy's the mathematician of the two of us, but that means that, 86% don't. And we need to identify gaps in the knowledge base of the public health workforce, provide funding and time for them to be better educated. And we need to have a better voice in government. That's where the money's going to come from. And since governmental public health is the primary actor in the public health community, governmental public health is prohibited from lobbying. So we need to figure out a way to get money to the public health workforce, to bolster them, to educate them, and to keep them, to retain them in their positions.
I'll throw out, I don't have a solution to this, I'm just gonna throw out a problem. I like to do that. It was brought to my attention recently, a few of the bills that were trying to be passed in the recent legislative session in the state, collectively, the one required pharmacists to prescribe ivermectin to individuals who would like it, who had COVID. And the second would allow for ivermectin to be prescribed through standing order, effectively meaning that you didn't even need a physician to write you a prescription. You could have one physician in the state, say a political actor, say that everybody in the state could get ivermectin, and then you'd have a pharmacist who had to prescribe it or pay a very large fine. What struck me about that is we see this vein of anti-science. It's not just happening in West Virginia, it's happening nationwide. One thing that I am really concerned about when I think about that is anytime you have people sort of turn away from traditional medicine, turn away from the traditional healthcare system, and not trust it, you sort of have to ask why. What is it about the system that's not meeting their needs, that they feel as though they need to look to something that's unproven, that's unwarranted, that's untested? What is it about the system that's not meeting their needs that they feel the need to go elsewhere and to look for something different? And I worry that kind of thing we're going to see more and more and more in these types of communities. And I for one am going to be giving a lot of thought to how our system has sort of become a place that many people don't trust and don't want to seek care from, and what we might do to rehabilitate that in the future.
I think that's a really good point. I was going to say something about, making sure we have, paid leave and various job safeguards in place that people could actually access care. But I think your point is so important. And I've done more work kind of with like urban minority populations, and they're very like understandable and really real reasons based in kind of historical atrocities for mistrusting the healthcare system. But I think we have seen reasons for mistrust that are very real, and we have to, somehow, if we're going to overcome, this misinformation addition, kind of like secondary pandemic that has occurred, we need to, start addressing these questions and these very real concerns and fears that people have, and trying to understand where they come from. And I think, as an epidemiologist, I do feel like public health, there's a lot to be said for the messaging that has failed throughout this pandemic, and the struggle with communicating how the science evolves, and allowing people, trusting people to be able to take in information rather than trying to kind of craft the perfect message. I think we need to maybe err on the side of just being more transparent. I'm not a public health communication expert, but definitely that's an area that we need to work on.
Well, look, we have 1 minute to spare. There you go. It was
Problem solved. It's all better. All better. We're all better.
everything's improved now. So I have to share with you, 45 minutes later, I'm just as intimidated as I was when we began this conversation, but I'm also incredibly appreciative of all of your willingness to share your thoughts and your knowledge with us. Will you all join me in thanking them for their time? And on that note, I will trust that you'll be able to get to your questions maybe at some point this afternoon, but I'm going to hand it right back over to your student leadership.
All right, thank you to all of our panelists. That was a great way to kick off the panels and to start off our afternoon. We're gonna take about 15 minutes of another break. I'm a big fan of breaks, in case you guys haven't noticed. We're gonna take about 15 minutes, and then we're gonna kick off the international law portion of our symposium. Thank you guys so much. And thank you, she's gone.
Oh no, I flew yesterday. I had to teach an online class last night, so I had to get here. I mean, I can just set up in like the cafeteria, but there's a place I can like set up on my laptop and.
Yeah, actually, yeah, the next talk should be wrapping up at like 3. The next talk will be wrapping up about 3 anyway. Perfect. All right, sounds good. Can you hear me, Professor Johnson? Perfect. Okay, we'll get started at about 2:15, so just hang out until then. Thank you. So I'll weirdly hold this in my hand. Kind of come over here. Okay, welcome everyone. We're going to get started up again after our break. So for anyone I haven't spoken with, hi, my name is Kate. I am editor-in-chief of the Law Review, and I really thank you all for being here, and especially our presenters. And next up, we will be hearing from Professor Kit Johnson. Professor Johnson is a professor at the University of Oklahoma College of Law, where she teaches immigration, crimmigration, and civil procedure. So her scholarship with us in issue 3 focuses on immigration with a particular emphasis on authorized migration. So today she's going to be presenting on her paper that is entitled The Immigration Solution for Improving Rural Healthcare. So please welcome Professor Kit Johnson.
Thank you guys so much for having me, and thank you for allowing me to participate remotely today. I really appreciate you guys adjusting on the fly with that. So I'm very interested in the issue of rural healthcare. Like many of the folks who spoke today, it came to me from personal experience. I spent 7 years living in North Dakota, in Grand Forks, North Dakota, which is actually a reasonably large size city in North Dakota, but very small compared to where I live now on the outskirts of Oklahoma City. And when we needed healthcare, anybody in my family, it was very difficult to find. We were thrilled when we would find a specialist in Fargo, which is the largest city in North Dakota, because that meant it was a mere hour and 15-minute drive each way right? And, negative temperatures and snow, but we're happy to only have to travel that far. But we found that we also had to sometimes travel all the way to Minneapolis, which was a good 5.5, 6 hour drive, or even to Rochester, Minnesota, which would be another 8 hours one way from where we were. And I know at that time, I just started looking into this issue of the shortage of medical care providers in rural America. And you come to realize that there is just a tremendous shortage of medical workers in the country overall. But it's one that significantly affects more rural communities. And since we're here talking in West Virginia today, it's worth noting that, according to government statistics, 25%, a full quarter of the counties in West Virginia are suffering some sort of shortage of medical professionals. And that's a really huge number. All rural counties, I should say that. And like I said, because the shortages are manifesting nationwide, when there is an opportunity to fill a position for a medical professionals who are born and raised in the United States tend to want to work where they were born and raised. And for many, that means returning to cities and major metropolitan areas. And I think that there's going to be so much tie-in between what I'm talking about today and what Hannah talked about earlier, right? If people are not presented with the opportunity that it is possible to work within their own communities, again, they're going to be drawn into that. Where are the practices already located? And that's metropolitan areas. So when we don't have enough people in the United States who are skilled in the work that we need done, who are willing to work in the areas where we need them to work, it makes sense to look outside of our country for solutions. And that means immigration. And immigration is not I should start with Immigration 101. I'm going to assume that no one here knows anything about immigration. And so I'm going to sort of walk you through a little bit of the sort of two types of immigration that we currently utilize to fill holes in the medical field in rural communities and how those can be improved. So first, legal migration is really driven into two different types. We have what are called non-immigrants and immigrants. And this has to do with both what people are allowed to do and how long they are allowed to stay in the country. So first, I want to talk to you about non-immigrants. Non-immigrants are people who come to the United States for a short time and for a specific limited purpose. So we do have a visa that's applicable for foreign medical graduates who can come to the United States to study medicine, and the duration of their status is for as long as it takes to finish their studies on medicine. And this is called the J-1 visa. There is a real downside to the J-1 visa for foreign medical graduates, which is that it requires the individual who receives it to spend 2 years overseas after they are done graduating, essentially return to their countries of origin, practice for 2 years, and then return to the United States. The reason we have this system in play is because the J-1 visa comes out of a history of cultural exchanges, where the goal was to change other countries and their perceptions of the United States by having exchanges. And if individuals don't return home, then there's no exchange. And so since, I'd say about the 50s, the government has required people to spend 2 years abroad after the end of their studies. So that's a real downside. There are federal waivers that exist to this program that would allow people to remain in the country. There's actually 4 different medical waivers. Federal waivers. There is the Department of Health and Human Services itself has a waiver. And one part of it would seem to offer a opportunity to bring medical professionals to serve in rural communities, but it's actually not functioning in a way that helps solve that problem. The Department of Veterans Affairs also offers waivers for people who are willing to work in VA facilities, some portion of which are in rural communities. The VA does acknowledge that many of their patients do live in rural communities. But the VA is very hesitant to use these visas. It says it's sort of their last option and not a go-to option. And then the other two are geography based. So there's the Appalachian Regional Commission and the Delta Regional Authority. And on a regional basis, they are able to bring people to the United States or allow them to stay after their 2 years have ended. But all of those waivers really pale in comparison to the state waiver. And the photo I have up here is from North Dakota, former state senator Kent Conrad. And he came up with this idea of why don't we let states decide whether they need people to serve in underserved areas, and then the state can sponsor a foreign medical graduate to work in their community. And it's not a permanent law. It's one that has to keep re-upping every few years. And it has offered more slots over time. So it started out by giving states 20 available slots where they could ask for waivers, and now states have 30. And they participate in this program to a greater or lesser degree, but about 90% of all waivers for the J-1 visa come through this program. And it's a mechanism by which people are able to join, get healthcare providers, specifically physicians, for rural communities. And so it's all set up with that intent. All right, I now have a short video and I'm not sure if it'll work. So let's try it. If it does, great. It doesn't. Okay, well, Aziz Ansari has a very hilarious video that I show every year to my students, where he talks about going home, right? So he goes back home and he runs into a friend, and the friend says that he's going to be practicing in Alabama for a period of time. And Aziz is like, why Alabama? And he says, well, I don't have lawful permanent residence. This is the way I get to stay in America. And then Aziz goes on to say, like, how horrible that is, that you're stuck in Alabama. But what his comedy fails to understand or appreciate, and although it is very funny, is the idea that immigrants are actually a particularly wonderful option for rural communities, specifically because they lack community ties to anywhere in the United States. Therefore, when they come to a rural community and establish community ties there, they are more likely to stay. And so it's just a really wonderful synergy that comes from bringing in people from abroad. I also think we could do more. We could create a new visa, the W visa. We could make it available to any medical professional, again, in light of what Hannah was talking about earlier. It doesn't necessarily have to be physicians. We could be looking at physical therapists, dentists, nurses, PAs, whatever we need, if they are committed to serving in a underserved community for a period of time. We could have it be subject to state sponsorship, much like the Kent Conrad solution that we have, or it could be private. It could be a rural hospital that is having trouble filling the roles that it needs to, and it could be available for that. The bottom are sort of technical little notes about immigration, but I believe that any new visa should be dual intent. That means it both allows someone to come for a limited time on that non-immigrant visa, but also allows them to convert to the other track, which is the immigrant track, which allows them to stay in the United States permanently if that opportunity arises. I also suggest that the W visa not be capped, meaning that it be unlimited, so that it be determined by how much the need is in any community, and that the community can just apply for whatever number it needs. So different from the Kent Conrad, where you only have 30 a year and only for physicians. And I also recommend that it be renewable because of this. There is a problem that non-immigrants face in coming to the United States, and that all of the J visa people fall to, and that is that we only allow any particular country to get 7% of the total number of visas that are available in any given year. And as a result, that really creates a significant backlog for countries with the highest sending numbers. And so among them, I will tell you, is India. India is one of the countries that sends us the highest number of immigrants on any given year. And they also send a large number of physicians. So at the moment, we are processing permanent visas or immigrant visas for individuals from India that were filed more than 10 years ago. So someone right now would have to wait 10 years. Some anticipate that it would be incredibly much longer than that before they are even eligible for a long-term solution. And so that's a really tricky thing about immigration. And we've had a couple of different ideas about how to solve it. I'd say the most promising right now is the idea of recapturing, which is also kind of complex, but we allow a certain number of visa people to come in each year. And if we don't use those visas, then theoretically they could be used in some other year. And so right now there is a bipartisan action to recapture. It's the Healthcare Workforce Resilience Act that would like to recapture a certain number of visas and make them available to make this transition easier for individuals. And so I kind of jumped the gun there, but I think what is helpful to understand, or what I'm trying to say is, if you come as a non-immigrant, you're coming for a limited time. Like I said, for many people, that's the duration of studying in the United States, and they can only do one thing, like study in the United States. When someone is admitted as an immigrant, that's synonymous with lawful permanent resident, LPR, and green card holder. People use those terms interchangeably. And if they come in this status, then they have the right to stay forever and indeed one day become a US citizen. So of course, this is what people want. And so right now we have a lot of individuals who are on those J1 waivers, and they're running out of time because of that 7% cap on the per country number of visas that can be issued each year. But we do also have some ways in which we facilitate the arrival of physicians and other medical professionals in this lawful permanent resident status. We admit people to the United States on immigrant as family members because they have jobs or because they win actually a lottery. We have a lottery for coming to the United States. And while it's certainly true that medical professionals could be family members or could win the lottery, most are coming on an employment base visa. And we have sort of some recognition that we should treat medical professionals differently. We have something called a special immigrant physician visa that is just for physicians. And it sounds great, right? You're a physician, yay, you get a visa. But actually it's a really niche law that only applies to people who have currently been practicing for 44 years. So not very useful right now. And in terms of Schedule A nurses and physical therapists, as well as national interest waivers, what both of these do is to say there's a lot of steps that you need to follow before you can come into the country and get your visa and start to work here. And all that we do is we allow certain nurses, physical therapists, and people who it's in our national interest to jump one of those steps, and they can come here a little bit faster. In terms of what we could do to improve the situation, one thing we could do is update the visas that are available for physicians. We could pick any date that's not 44 years ago, and it would be better. So, and we do this similar in another setting. It's called registry, where we just say, if you've been here for a certain period of time, you get to stay. And I think that that's very similar to what could be done with physicians. It's just advance the date so that more people would be eligible for it. And in particular, what I would really like to do with updating that number is be able to capture those individuals who are already present in the United States and working in rural communities on waivers, but who haven't yet been able to convert to that green card status. So that would be a great way to capture them. And other things we could do is allow state sponsorship of immigrants. For example, we could take the Conrad 30 program that allows states to seek waivers for individuals to allow them to stay instead of returning to their home country. And right now they get to stay on a non-immigrant status. Well, states might be really interested in having them stay on a permanent basis. And so that could be something that we do. This would be very new to immigration law. It's not new in the sense that it is something that Canada does, that Australia does. So community partners around the world do this sort of sponsorship, but it's not something that we do in the United States. There are, however, other challenges that are present when we're talking about using immigration to solve the rural healthcare crisis. And in particular, we've gone through 2 large immigration crises in the last 5 years. So under the presidency of Donald Trump, we had the Muslim ban, where he banned people from entering the United States if they lived in certain countries around the world. And we've also had a variety under both President Trump and under President Biden of bans that are related to COVID and the coronavirus. In each of these contexts, theoretically, there were waivers that were available to individuals, but they were very hard to get. And I think we could sort of recognize that crises are going to continue to keep happening. And we can have in place an idea that there will always be a very quick waiver that is available for rural healthcare workers in any time that crises suspend migration. And then second, another challenge that came up is during the administration of President Trump, there was a real lack of commitment to legal migration. I mean, there was a lot of news that, where he talked a lot about his interest in preventing undocumented migration, unlawful migration. And that's its own, kettle of fish, as it were. But sort of behind the scenes and what non-immigration practitioners aren't aware of are the numerous ways that the administration sought to literally restrict lawful migration and just created problems. And so we have to and that was unusual. It hasn't sort of happened in prior administrations. It's certainly not happening in the current administration, although there's a lot of digging out that we have to do. So it may be that particular challenge is one that has already been overcome, but it's certainly one that we want to keep an eye out for. And as someone who researches legal migration, I think it's something that we really do want to have a commitment to because it is in our nation's interest. And so I just really, really believe that we have a real opportunity to use immigration procedures that already exist, that we can expand on, that we can grow, to bring immigrants to our rural communities where they can develop roots and are likely to stay and continue to provide the needed health care on a going forward basis. Thank you.
All right, Professor Johnson, can you hear me? Okay. It looks like we have plenty of time for questions, so we're going to take some questions from the audience. Anyone? Perfect.
Hi, Professor Johnson. Thank you for that. And I just want to say I found that to be a very creative and intriguing solution to this issue. I do have one question, though. As Professor Haxgard presented earlier, she used the term outsiders to describe people that are not from these communities. Would you perceive the acceptance of immigrants in these rural communities to be a problem or a challenge that we have to overcome?
That's an interesting question. The way I heard Professor Haxgard talk about outsiders, and I welcome her to speak up and see if I've got her story wrong, but was more in the sense of the savior complex of an outsider. Like, I am here to fix your community, as opposed, and I'm going to come in and I'm not going to open my doors to have my school educate you, right? That was sort of the theme I got from her story. And I don't think that immigrants fall into that same category, right? So there's an interesting study, right? There's some huge percentage of individuals worldwide who would like to move to the United States if the opportunity presented it, right? There's a huge, millions of people worldwide want to come here. And for those who have medical training, many of them are willing to trade the opportunity to come to the United States to live in a community that they wouldn't otherwise think about joining. And put down roots. And we just have a lot of examples where that has worked. I mean, clearly there are going to be challenges. I certainly, in Grand Forks, North Dakota, I can pinpoint particular challenges we had or community members had with a very visible refugee population that looked very different than these sort of core North Dakotan population that had been there for a long time, like wore visibly different clothing and so on. But I think communities are so desperate for healthcare providers, right? They're so intensely grateful. So I'm gonna like tear up, but I just remember being how grateful I was when a provider was just in Fargo and only an hour and a half away one way, that I think there's a different sense of welcoming when it comes to professionals than the concerns that have been raised with refugees. We can talk about whether that's cool or not, right? Totally different question. But I think that the desire to welcome is a really self-interested one that answers some of the problems.
I'm going to go ahead and throw out a question. I, first of all, really, really loved this talk. I work day in and day out with J-1 visa holders and H-1B visa holders. So the marriage of our health law and that specific aspect of international and immigration law was really cool. And I really like the idea that you presented of a new visa. I think you called it the W visa. Because like you just said, there are so many people across the world that would love to come to America if the opportunity would present itself. So what are the practical limits on that? Like basically, like when we're talking about it in a practical sense, like it sounds like such an easy solution, so why aren't we doing it?
I mean, we're not doing it because we can't pass any law, much less immigration law right now. So I think it's a great idea. I think it would really work. I think we just have to wait until we have a Congress and a Senate that's really willing to work across the aisle to get something like that done. And that's why I propose some of the smaller solutions, like taking Kent Conrad's program and making it permanent. So we don't have to keep re-upping it legislatively every time it expires, or transforming the Kent Conrad program into one where it's giving people LPR status as opposed to non-immigrant status, or updating the SIV for physicians. I just think those are smaller solutions that would be helpful, but are more likely to happen, more practical than creating a whole new visa. It's been a while since we've gotten a new visa created.
Thank you. Any other questions? All right. I'll go here first, then there. Okay.
Thanks for this wonderful presentation, Professor Johnson. So I spent a couple years at the U.S. Agency for International Development, and obviously we invest in trying to strengthen the health systems of other countries. And so this brain drain that this would produce is a real concern to me. On a couple of levels, right? Just the moral question of whether wealthy countries should be drawing away the health resources of other countries, and maybe even the health consequences. So, with COVID, we've seen the moral issue of Africa barely, a very small percentage vaccinated, where more wealthy countries are reaching much higher percentages. But then the result is health threats coming to the wealthy countries as well from those unvaccinated, and certainly that scenario could play out without adequate health personnel in countries. And so I wonder if you could address sort of the moral and also the international health effects and threats this could produce.
Absolutely. And I should let you know that your issues are ones that actually many law students have tackled. There's actually a number of articles that I cite in this paper that really delve into that concept. I don't see a moral problem, mainly because of another article that I wrote called Theories of Immigration Law, where I sort of talk about why do we have the immigration laws that we do, sort of where do they come from? And one of the sort of theories is that of individual rights. And I really, really believe in that. And I think it really resonates in terms of sort of our US political history and sort of allowing people to make their own choices about their lives instead of requiring choices to be put on them. Like, for the good of your country, we're not going to allow you to immigrate to the United States, even though you have a right to or are able to. So that's just where I come out on the brain drain argument, is that I just believe that people should be allowed to move wherever they want. And I also have a belief that other people from other countries will want to go to that country, right? Until eventually you get to a point where that doesn't work. But I do understand it. I mean, it certainly is a concern. And it certainly is, it's not inconsequential, and it's just a big question. And so I guess I'm going to answer it on the moral grounds that I just really believe that people should have the right to choose where they end up. And obviously, of course, it's in our interest that they end up here.
Hannah Haxgard here. I do have a question for you, but I hope you'll indulge me a comment first, which is my dad ended up serving in a small town in South Dakota as a state physician, and all of his coworkers were immigrants because they couldn't get any United States physicians to come and stay, and it created a nice sort of a nice community of physicians and a nice community for me growing up. I guess my question for you, though, would be, I'm curious to hear if the Indian Health Services or other federal agencies have other powers beyond what you spoke about today. I guess I was wondering, as you were talking, are states actually better off because of these state waivers you mentioned? And has there been discussion about letting tribes do similar things to apply for these waivers? Is that happening, or is it something that should happen?
That is super interesting. And as far as I know, no, that doesn't happen. There's only the 4 federal waivers that I mentioned, and then the state. And so no, there is no tribal equivalent for it. And I actually have really, until this question, never really thought about it, even though I know many people who have worked for the Indian Health Service. But it has not come, and including in Alaska. I actually was just talking to a nurse at the hospital, was that last night, who had served for many years in a rural community in Alaska as part of IHS. So I think that's a great idea. And that also, kind of going back to the prior question about sort of what are practical options we could do, I don't think it would take anything to make that something that IHS could do, right? Because it's an established, we have a national interest waiver that exists, and you just need to tie federal programs to it. It's just that we only have so many that are. So I don't think it would really take anything but an agency being interested in it and then talking to USCIS about how to become part of the waiver process. So that's a great idea.
All good questions. Do we have any others? We do, but it's going to take me a minute to get over there.
So, hi, Professor Johnson, and thank you again for this wonderful talk. This is definitely something I know so little about. And so I think my kind of initial question would really be, what are some of the barriers to, getting licensed to practice, once an, immigrant physician comes over here, and, how, different barriers, obviously, within what are nurses allowed to do in their home country versus, what they can do here, and kind of that transition from their licensing in their home country to their licensing here.
That's a really good question, and it is really complicated. I can tell you one thing, which is that no matter how many years somebody has been a doctor in their country, so someone could have been a pediatric endocrinologist in India for 10 years, and if they want to come to the United States, they have to come on a J-1 visa and enroll in a residency program. And so there's also sort of technical problems with that, right? You have to engage in matching and all of the stuff that goes on with becoming a resident, but there's no grace given for prior work. So they have to follow this J-1 path of going to school, doing the residency, and then looking for a waiver to stay in the United States, and then hoping someone is going to sponsor them for a green card position. So that's the rule for all physicians. Nurses, I know a little less about, but I do know that they are not required to do programs in the United States, but there is significant amount of testing. And at one point, the testing was only available in Guam, and you had to spend a huge amount of money to go to Guam to take the test. And the fail rate was like 50%. They've changed things since then. So there are more test taking opportunities in places around the country. So there is that. And I will also say, around the world, I'm sorry, not country, that wouldn't be helpful. The COVID crisis has also caused many states to work with nurses who might exist in their communities who aren't practicing, so who have international experience. So reaching out and trying to get them to be able to pass English exams or whatever other small exams that they might have in order to get their licenses. So licensing is a real issue. It's really complicated, but I can say that people are thinking about it and working on it now.
Further questions? All right, I'm seeing none, so we will take yet another quick break. We will probably reconvene at 3. I know we're a little ahead of schedule, but is that okay? We will reconvene at 3. That way, we have a little break after Professor Moore's presentation to get you back on the Zoom, Professor Johnson, for the panel. Thank you. Also, Professor, I don't know if you were planning to move around a little bit.
Hello, I'm good. How are you? Good to see you.
This will be your clicker to move the PowerPoint, and then if you think you'll want to move around a little bit, you can wear the pocket mic, or you can stand in front of that one.
Can I have the pocket mic?
Yeah,
If I
absolutely.
go in there, will it create?
I don't think so. It hasn't so far.
Okay, perfect.
So,
Good deal.
Let me just get that on.
I know. I was like, I'm so used to like having them on. I'll take
know,
mine
and
off.
I put my glasses fog, so I will put the glasses on, take the mask off.
Sounds good. All right, everyone. I think we're going to get started again. Welcome back. Our next presenter is David Moore. He is a professor, the Sterling and Eleanor Colton Endowed Chair in Law at Brigham Young University's J. Reuben Clark Law School, and also the Associate Director at the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. He is a scholar of foreign relations law, international human rights, and international development. Today, he will be presenting his paper entitled International Human Rights as a Vehicle for Achieving Rural Health.
Let's see, is this working? Yep, sounds like it. Thank you, Maggie. What Maggie didn't mention is last semester I was able to spend 2 weeks here teaching a course on human rights and health, so that was a real privilege, and it's fun to see some familiar faces. I want to thank Jalen and Jared and the law school for organizing this event and inviting me. I'm glad to be here with you. After 2 delayed flights and an overnight in Detroit, I'm especially glad to be here with you. But I've already enjoyed so much the discussion we've had and learned from our experts in public health and health law, and so I'm grateful for this dialogue. So as Maggie mentioned, I want to talk about the role of human rights, international human rights, in addressing rural health issues. And that there may seem a lot of distance between international human rights and the issues that rural areas face. And I hope to narrow that distance and show how the human rights framework, at least, can be a helpful tool as we look at the challenges in rural health areas. To start out, I want to acknowledge that I have 2 co-authors on this paper and presentation. They couldn't be here, but I wanted to introduce them. On the right is Emily Lauder, who is a 3rd year at BYU Law School. Essentially served as a law clerk to me. I had a very brief term on the UN Human Rights Committee, which focuses on civil and political rights, but is a sister committee to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Committee, which I'll talk about today. And Emily has developed some expertise in international human rights and health, and is a real passionate advocate for human rights. My other co-author is Cami Scheel, who is a JD MBA and also an RN. And so she's been critical in our effort to look at how international human rights, that framework, might actually make a difference or sort of where it points on rural health issues. So I want to acknowledge and thank them, even though they couldn't be here. So like Professor Johnson, I want to start by assuming that most of us don't know much about international law or international human rights. Again, having had some of you in class, I know you do, but make sure we're all on the same page and understanding just the basic framework we're talking about. So starting very broadly, when we talk about international law, we're focused on 2 primary sources of law. One is treaties, these agreements that states formally negotiate and formally consent to, and through that consent are bind themselves to certain obligations under international law. The other form of customary international law is, international law is customary international law, which is not formally negotiated by states. It's not formally ratified by states. Instead, it's defined as law that develops as states come to engage in a consistent practice. And not just a consistent practice that they're doing habitually, but a practice that they come to feel is legally binding upon them. And so often you'll have something develop as a principle or a norm of customary international law, and once it reaches that stage where states are generally complying with it and have the sense that it's binding upon them, then we're in a position to enter a treaty and codify those norms in a treaty. But then the treaty may grow old, and customary international law can be the vehicle then for state practice to change and new international law norms to develop, which again may lead to a treaty or not. And so customary international law is not something you can find in a particular place. It's again something you identify by looking at what states are doing and whether they feel bound as a matter of international law to that. So human rights is one area of international law. Others would be the law of war, refugee law, etc. But human rights is sort of one topic in international law. And really is born of the Holocaust. There are some antecedents to it, but it was really the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust that brought the world together to say, we need to do something internationally to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. And so we get, shortly after World War II, the formation of the United Nations, with the General Assembly as its sort of legislative body where each member state of the United Nations is represented and can vote on matters before the United Nations. And one of the first things that the General Assembly did was to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this is the foundation of the modern international human rights system. So this was the first document that came together, where the nations of the world came together and declared a set of international human rights standards. Now, the Universal Declaration was just a General Assembly resolution, and by treaty, General Assembly resolutions are not binding as a matter of international law. They aren't treaties. But the Universal Declaration has become so influential that most would say it reflects customary international law and can be binding on states through this source of law that is customary. The Universal Declaration then recognizes the right to health. Though the right to health gets recognized right at the foundation of the international human rights system. Though under this language maybe a little indirectly, right, it's a right to a standard of living that's adequate for health and some of these other things, with some particular emphasis on care for motherhood and childhood. But we get the right to health recognized right off in the Universal Declaration. Again, though, not immediately binding on states. So the thought was that the Universal Declaration would serve as a foundation for a treaty that would then create binding human rights obligations. We had the Cold War develop and different emphases on or political commitments to different types of rights. So the West favoring civil and political rights, things like the right to vote, free speech, right? The East focused more on things like the right to work or the right to food, the right to housing. And so it was impossible to create a single treaty that embodied all the rights reflected in the Universal Declaration, which resulted in two treaties: the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, addressing things like free speech, freedom of religion or belief, the right to vote, the rights of criminal defendants, and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, protecting the right to health, the right to housing, the right to education, etc. Together, these documents are referred to as the International Bill of Rights. Again, these are sort of the core of the human rights system. And I have the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights bolded there because, as we'll look at in a moment, it is the one that codifies the right to health. Now, these are not the only human rights treaties. I've got up here the other core human rights treaties, 9 core international human rights treaties, and some of these also address health. So the Convention on the Rights of the Child, for example, references, talks about the health rights of children. But the core guarantee internationally of a right to health is Article 12 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And that treaty says that the states parties who sign it, about 171 countries have signed on to the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant. The United States has not. It is signed but not ultimately ratified. But a large number of countries have ratified and therefore have assumed this obligation to recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest standard of health, right? Both physical and mental. The covenant goes on to identify certain steps that parties who assume this obligation should take to achieve the right to health. And so you get things like reducing infant mortality, but this is not a comprehensive list. This is, illustrative of things state parties should do to satisfy their obligation to respect the right to health. Now, in all of this, right, you get this detail of sort of illustrative things to do to respect this right, but there's not a lot of detail in the covenant to understand what the right to health guarantees. Fortunately, the core human rights treaties create, or there has been created, what are called treaty bodies, committees of independent experts who are tasked with overseeing compliance with the treaty. And so those 9 core human rights treaties, each of them has a treaty body, a committee that oversees compliance with the treaty. And in total, there are 10 of these committees. The Convention on Torture has 2, one for prevention and one for response. And these treaty bodies generally, they have a variety of functions, but sort of the core functions are these 3 listed. So under the treaties, states parties are obligated to report to the committees on their human rights practices under the treaties. And so periodically states come in, they report. International NGOs will supplement those reports. As you can imagine, they can be self-serving. Right? So NGOs will come in, supplement those reports with additional information. The committees will review them. They'll engage in what's called a constructive dialogue with the state, where the state sends representatives to Geneva. They engage in a dialogue, asking additional questions. And the ultimate product are what are called concluding observations, where the committees say, this is what we're concerned about, and these are the steps that we recommend that you take. The second function is to issue what are called general comments. Again, there isn't a lot of content in the treaties themselves, but the committees take these and will issue comments on what the right entails. Right? What does this right to health obligation look like with greater particularity than the treaty itself provides? And finally, many of the treaty bodies can hear individual communications concerning human rights violations. So individuals can come to the committee and complain of violations of the covenant, including the right to health, before the committee. The committee will review those and issue its views on whether there's been a violation and identify a remedy that the state must provide. So as I mentioned, the committee, the treaty body that oversees the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is the treaty that guarantees the right to health, is the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And so through these 3 main functions, the committee has given us a more detailed sense of what the international human right to health entails. So the committee has heard individual communications on the right to health, but really has not provided a lot of guidance through this mechanism. There's only been one communication that I'm aware of on the right to health that the committee has deemed admissible and has actually decided. So we don't get a lot of guidance from the Committee on the Right to Health under the communications function. We do, however, have repeated concluding observations to states as they report to the committee, where the committee has expressed concern about a state's compliance with the right to health and recommended that they take certain steps. So we get some understanding of what that international right means from these concluding observations. And finally, the committee has issued a general comment number 14 on the right to health. And so this is where we get a lot of the meat or our understanding of what the international human right to health entails. And helpfully, the committee has adopted this framework for thinking about the international human rights right to health. That's the AAQ framework, where the committee says the right to health includes these 4 elements: availability, accessibility, appropriateness or acceptability, and quality. So looking a little bit in more detail about what each of these means, I think it's interesting, as we've heard different presentations, a lot of the problems that have been identified so far in the symposium, right, fit within these categories that the committee has identified. So when it comes to availability, the committee says that the right to health guarantees a sufficient quantity. And this is not just health facilities, health care, right? It includes what are called the determinants of health, right? The sort of the inputs you need to be able to achieve health. Things like safe and potable drinking water, hospitals, clinics, that ties in more to the healthcare, right? Personnel, drugs, those sorts of things. The committee has clarified this is not a right to be healthy, but sort of to have the opportunity to achieve health by having access to these, or having these inputs of health available, as well as sufficient quantity of facilities, services, and programs. So when it comes to availability, again, we're looking at, is it there, right? Are the clinics, the drugs, the personnel, are they there? The second aspect of this AAQ framework then is accessibility. And again, this is a theme that we keep hearing about in the symposium as an issue in rural areas. Accessibility has 4 underlying conditions. It needs to health services, programs, facilities need to be available without discrimination. And the committee is very broad, and the covenant itself is very broad in terms of different sorts of statuses that can be subject to discrimination. So it's sort of typical things, race, religion, gender, et cetera, but goes on to say sort of any other status. So it could include, rural versus urban. There's a prohibition on discrimination in that sense. The second part of accessibility, physical accessibility, right? So that the facility, services, et cetera, are physically, geographically accessible and in a safe sort of way. Then we look at economic accessibility or affordability, that people, even if it's there, right, they need to be able to afford it for it to be considered accessible. And finally, this accessibility element includes a requirement of information accessibility, that you can have access to and you can share information about health. And of course, this is critical in order for people to be able to achieve their own health, right? Whether where they're working on their health alone, right? They need the information to do that, but also in interacting with healthcare providers, right? That need for information so they can make informed decisions about their health. The third element then, acceptability. This is focused not on medical acceptability, but more cultural acceptability, right? That it's appropriate culturally, ethically, that it respects minorities, particular communities. It's sensitive to gender issues and to differences in stage of life cycle. And finally, the committee said the right to health includes this element of quality. And here we pick up on medical standards, that we do have skilled personnel, we've got safe, unexpired drugs, equipment that's approved, that sort of thing. Now, this obviously is a very expansive view of the right to health. Each of these AAQ requirements gives us a really broad look at what is necessary to achieve the right to health. And when you look out at the world, particularly in rural areas, there is obviously a massive gap between what the committee is writing is the right to health and what people are actually experiencing. So our inclination as lawyers to minimize, reduce that gap is often to turn to judicial enforcement. Give people rights they can take to court to achieve the right to health. And there have been a couple of countries that have been really active in this. Not so much directly relying on the international human right to health, but on provisions in their constitutions that guarantee a right to health. And so in South Africa, for example, the court has, I think this is the Constitutional Court, addressed a situation where there was a state program to provide drugs to HIV-positive pregnant women. But the way the program was set up, it was only accessible to a small portion of the population. And so the court recognized, right, that lack of accessibility for a huge part of the population and pregnant women, right, was a violation of this right to health, and said the state needed to ensure accessibility. Also talked about information accessibility, saying before this drug is given to the women, right, they need to be counseled so that they can understand what's at stake, what are the consequences, et cetera, with taking this drug. India also, its courts have been very active with the right to health. There was a situation where a state-run hospital was missing things like electricity and other sort of basic things, potable water. And the state ruled that you have to have a certain standard of quality, and a lack of funding is not an excuse for respecting the quality requirement of the right to health. Also, a different case talked about affordability. Right? The state has an obligation to secure the right to health to those who can't afford it. So these cases demonstrate that judicial enforcement can have a role in achieving the right to health. But there are some problems with relying, at least exclusively, on judicial enforcement if we're trying to achieve the right to health, and particularly in rural areas. So some of the challenges are structural, and I would say these apply to economic, social, and cultural rights generally. They're not limited to the right to health. This sort of class of rights that often requires a significant dedication of resources presents some particular problems when it comes to judicial enforcement. So one is just competence. As I've sat here and listened to public health experts, I realize, I think we all realize, lawyers don't necessarily have that understanding, right? Or aren't trained to understand public health questions. They don't have a background on, say, big budgetary decisions or the administration of a national budget. And so generally, judges are generalists who don't have the sort of skills or background that might be needed to decide these right to health questions. In addition, at least in the United States and lots of countries, judges can't just sit down and address an issue. They don't get to just say, let's look at the right to health and have a case on the right to health and think about how the right to health could be achieved in our country, or whether it is being achieved and what the failings are. Instead, judges decide cases that individual litigants bring to them. And so they're limited in their opportunity to address right to health issues. Similarly, they're limited in the information they've got, right? The rules of discovery in litigation, the rules of evidence, strategic decisions by the parties to litigation limit what sort of information judges have when they're deciding cases. And so they're not in a position to know comprehensively what are the issues at stake, what are the competing demands, et cetera, when they're resolving cases, which make judges, courts, sort of an imperfect avenue for fully achieving the right to health. Similarly, there's sort of governance concerns. There's some democracy concerns. The International Covenant on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights recognizes that these sorts of rights require resource allocations. It talks about states achieving these rights to the maximum extent of their available resources. And so we have big allocation of public resources questions when it comes to health issues. And there's a sense that often these big decisions about how we commit public resources should be made through democratic processes, right? Not through just judges. Similarly, the content of these rights is pretty open, right? You could argue it would make sense to go through a democratic process to flesh out what these rights mean in a particular context. And there are transparency concerns about going through the courts. Legislatures hold public hearings, they keep records, they note votes that people take. Judges are meant to be in courts deliberately insulated from that. And so while you have public hearings, the decision-making process is meant to be out of the public eye. And so there's some transparency concerns there. Again, these are concerns that apply to economic, social, and cultural rights generally. There are particular concerns to relying on courts to achieve the human right to health in the rural setting. There is a link between ruralness and poverty. Both of those, sort of ruralness and poverty, are barriers to access to justice. When it comes to poverty, there is limited legal aid in the criminal side. Right? There's even less aid on the civil litigation side, where the right to health is likely to be disputed and litigated. Which means that people with greater resources, citizens who are more wealthy, are more likely to be able to access the legal system. Right? This is something the legal profession has recognized. I think recently we focused on legal aid. We still have a lot to do in that context. But there's also this middle group, sort of the middle class America, who doesn't have the resources and doesn't have free aid to litigate in the civil system. And so the result is that this link between poverty and access to justice means that if we rely on judicial enforcement, at least alone, we're likely to get wealthier individuals coming to the court to bring right to health claims, right? And judges then to be issuing judgments on the right to health in favor of people who have more resources than at least a segment of the population. So there's, again, this particular health with relying on judicial enforcement in rural areas where there's this link to poverty. Then there's just the fact that rural areas are often legal deserts as much as they are health deserts. So a lot of what we've been talking about, you just don't have the hospitals, the clinics, the doctors in rural areas that you have in urban areas. But the same is true for legal resources, right? The courts are farther away. It's hard to retain civil servants or harder to retain in rural areas, and to attract attorneys to rural areas. I don't have the statistic in front of me, but I think in North Dakota, of the 300-some towns, I think only about 50 of them had an attorney in them. Right? And often the attorneys that are in rural areas are aging, right? They're sort of nearing retirement, and it's not clear that they're going to be replaced. So just as we have a shortage of doctors, et cetera, in rural areas, there is a shortage of attorneys and legal professionals. And so trying to rely on judicial enforcement to achieve the right to health in rural areas bumps up against these legal problems that access to justice is also restricted in rural areas. So what does that mean? Right? I think it means we can't rely on some of our reflexive means for achieving legal rights, which is, again, judicial enforcement. That's often how we look to narrow the gap between right and reality. That doesn't mean that we give up on human rights as a vehicle for achieving the right to health or to achieving rural health. And in particular, I think this AAAQ framework that the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights has given us to understand the right to health can be very valuable in trying to achieve rural health. And this is sort of hit home to me today, as we have heard from the other panels, because you hear about aspects of accessibility, availability, appropriateness, quality in the different panels. And again, it sort of hits home that this is a fairly comprehensive framework for thinking about what are the problems and what are the potential solutions. So I want to spend just a little bit of time illustrating how this AAAQ framework that we get from international human rights might aid us in identifying problems and potential solutions to achieving the right to health, with West Virginia as a case study. And here, with a caveat, this is not meant to be comprehensive, right? This is not sort of the blueprint for solving rural health challenges in West Virginia, but it's meant to illustrate how this framework, this human rights framework, can help us think about these issues in a comprehensive sort of way. And again, I think we've seen that illustrated as elements of this have come up repeatedly in our discussions. So when we talk about availability, when we look, for example, at mental health, we've already, I think, alluded to this, right? That's a serious issue in rural areas, and particularly in West Virginia, where 5 of the counties in West Virginia have the highest rates of depression nationally, due to a variety of factors: poverty, the opioid crisis, et cetera. But that's aligned with the fact that the state is third worst nationally in terms of mental health providers. And so this availability lens helps us see that's at least one of our problems here, is a lack of available providers, and a lack of incentives for these providers to stay in the state. So there's already been talk about how would you solve that, right? Some of this might be done through telemedicine or these health apps, and we've obviously learned there are issues with those. This is not just a simple solution. There are lots of complex issues to think through, but there has been an effort to use apps to provide cognitive therapy online, right, to people in more remote areas. And so that might be an avenue to addressing the availability question. There's talk about loan forgiveness programs, et cetera, or also just investing in communities to make them more attractive places to attract healthcare providers. We heard from Professor Johnson, potentially immigrants who might be willing to put down roots in particular communities, right, might be ways to address some of these availability issues. Again, with accessibility, we've got these 4 elements, the first being non-discrimination. If we look through that lens at West Virginia, there are some issues that are likely to be prominent in rural West Virginia. One is that in rural areas, generally, the population tends to be older. And so age discrimination can be a particular issue with rural health. Discrimination against people from Appalachia, right, is an issue in the state, where people with a certain accent or from a certain area, right, might face discrimination. This will help us narrow in on that. Discrimination based on wealth, obviously a potential and probably particular issue. Discrimination based on race, where there are significant disparities in health with regard to race in West Virginia. And there was an interesting study, or some interesting work done by a former professor from this university in the School of Public Health, who identified that racial discrimination is not just a barrier to health care, but can be a cause of poor health. The stress, the sort of continual stress of racial discrimination has physiological effects such that race discrimination is not just a question of ensuring access to medical resources, but is itself an impediment to the right to health that needs to be addressed through that lens as well. Accessibility includes physical accessibility, and this is an issue in rural areas generally that leads to serious health consequences, as indicated up here, or and also health expenses like hospitalizations that may be unnecessary. We've already talked about in the symposium some of the reasons for that: lack of public transportation, internet, et cetera, making healthcare inaccessible. Just the topography of the state makes it difficult. I was really, Professor Johnson's experience of traveling 8 hours to a specialist, not in this state, really brought that home, right? That just the distance of having to travel without necessarily having strong infrastructure, partly due to topography, et cetera, can be a real barrier to these things. And so, possible solutions, mobile health units. In a concluding observation to Afghanistan, the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights commended Afghanistan for sort of mobile efforts to get to rural areas. And so that may be an opportunity. We've already talked about telehealth, so I won't spend a lot of time on that. But in a variety of areas, variety of specialties, telehealth has been shown to improve results, including on one of our panels said, you can't deliver a baby by telehealth, but there's been studies saying if you have a specialist on with the primary care provider in that moment, right, then they can do a lot to reduce problems at delivery. So even in that context, right, it may be helpful, which suggests that maybe internet access is one of the biggest things that can be done to address health issues in rural areas, and that's also been mentioned. When we talk about economic accessibility, this again has been an issue where West Virginia has the 4th highest poverty rates in the nation, and that having a direct impact, obviously, on access to health care and results that are obtained. And this economic accessibility can exist not just in access to doctors, clinics, et cetera. West Virginia has a significant problem with diabetes, 2nd highest in the nation, right, which is often correlated with food deserts, right? Lack of access to affordable, healthy food. And so again, this accessibility lens, thinking it through it, economic accessibility, can help us identify these are some of the problems that we're looking at. Some of this results from other things like subspecialists not participating in insurance plans, et cetera, and so those are problems we may need to face as well. And finally, in terms of accessibility, information accessibility as a key element there. West Virginia has serious issues with hepatitis C, and some of that is, or a lot of that is from the opioid crisis and needle sharing in drug use. And so often in harm prevention programs, in addition to needle share or supplying clean needles, right, there are efforts to communicate, right, these are the consequences, the risks, et cetera, of this sort of behavior. But also key sort of outside that context as well to communicate early on the risks, because early detection can be vital to ensuring that the effects of hepatitis C don't advance to sort of the worst scenario. So that providing of information key. When we talk about accessibility, one of the things we've talked about is medical avoidance and sort of that culture, particularly in the mental health area, where there's sort of a stigma of resorting to mental health professionals and programs. So, how do you make this more acceptable? We've talked about the apps, sort of the mHealth devices. And in West Virginia, the reluctance to engage in those, sort of 82% less likely to use mHealth. And so there's a real issue of acceptability, right? Teaching people, whether through their healthcare providers, through social influencers, whatever, of the value of these devices and making them more comfortable with these sort of things. Not just on the patient side, but also on the provider side to make sure that these reach the need. Finally, we look through the quality, the Q of AAQ. There's certainly issues in the state, but some of those can be resolved by focusing on those 3 A's. And then recognizing that measuring quality itself can improve quality. So there's been an effort in the state in collaboration with other states to make efforts to measure children's health with the result that health outcomes have improved. And so that Q can be helpful as well. So just in conclusion, again, the point is not that human rights or the human rights lens brings us easy solutions, and particularly through the court system, but it does provide a lens through this AAQ framework to think comprehensively about rural challenges, to identify those challenges, and then to be able to identify potential solutions. So although, again, we might not think of turning to human rights when we're talking about rural areas, probably the most distant from the center of Geneva, et cetera, the centers of human rights, I think there's real value to taking the lens of human rights to address rural health. Thank you. I think I went long. Yeah, please.
Who has questions, I can run the microphone to you if you would like.
These are better country roads, by the way.
So, how likely do you think it is that some sort of right to health or right to healthcare, or even just right to insurance could be recognized in the United States?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real challenge on a variety of fronts. We obviously don't have it directly in our Constitution. So amending the Constitution is very unlikely to get it as a constitutional right. And our relationship with international human rights is complicated. So we, as I mentioned, we are not a party to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So we've not assumed an obligation with regard to the right to health internationally. But this framework can be used, regardless whether you have a legal obligation to follow it or not. And so I think the more likely path is to use this lens in Congress, in public health discussions, et cetera, and to work as a matter of policy to implement the right, as opposed to, I think, the unlikely scenario of getting the right to be part of U.S. law and then to be enforceable in our courts as a matter of U.S. law. I mean, even if we were to sign on to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, it would most certainly be treated as what we call a non-self-executing treaty, which means that our courts cannot immediately enforce it. They have to wait for Congress to pass legislation to implement our obligations under the treaty, and then that legislation would be in force. But we don't need to necessarily go the treaty route to be able to try and achieve those things through legislation and other sort of policies. Good question.
Thank you, Kate. Great question.
Really interesting, David. Thanks. So this is kind of similar to, I think, what Kate asked you. But a lot of times in health law, we talk about statutes that don't have a private right of action, right? So you've got an individual patient who's harmed in some way, and they have no way to remediate their harm.
Right.
And it's up to some federal agency to investigate and bring some kind of claim. And the students often, we have the debate, like, whether a statute like that as an aspirational document is something that's really helpful in kind of setting a trajectory.
Yeah.
Even though there are a lot of speed bumps on the way to enforcement.
Yeah.
So I guess it's the same kind of question that Kate was getting at, which is, do you see any downside to having a document that's so aspirational, but it's very difficult to enforce? Does the populace lose faith in the rule of law when it can't be enforced? Or do you see that concern is ameliorated by the kind of aspirational nature of the document and its importance in kind of setting our trajectory?
Yeah.
I guess.
Great question. And I think there are multiple aspects of a response there. I think there can be value. Something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights wasn't binding. It wasn't a treaty immediately, but it has had a really significant influence, has generated binding obligations through treaty, has led to constitutions that have adopted international human rights, as in South Africa, India, has also led to direct court enforcement in some cases, or legislative enforcement through statute. And so I think an aspirational document can provide the momentum or the starting point for legal enforcement or legal accomplishment of what's in the document ultimately. On the other hand, you're right that there can be this sense, and we have this going on really prominently in the human rights system right now, where many have the sense that since World War II, we've recognized international human rights. We've spent a lot of time, a lot of people write about it. We have a lot of conferences. We get a lot of General Assembly resolutions and other documents. But look around the world, and that gap between right and reality, as you said, can lead people to think, I have no faith in this system. I mean, what we're seeing in Ukraine, as we sort of mentioned, right, has that potential impact on our sense of international law. Here's one of the key reasons the UN was founded. One of the key principles of the UN Charter is a prohibition on the use of force, right, except in very limited circumstances. And we're still seeing this sort of thing. So I think you're right that there is there can be a danger in as a result of this massive gap between our aspirational urges and documents and what we're really seeing. And I think there sometimes it's helpful to think beyond the right and this is sort of where I think, our reflex to judicial enforcement isn't always going to be the most helpful reflex. Right? That we should, if we're going to think about these in rights, we need to think about it as things we need to accomplish as a society, as a government. And that may not be through private rights of action. It may be through the administrative agency or some other mechanism. But I think we've got to think more broadly about rights than just I get to sue. Otherwise, there is this sense of what is this doing? It's an excellent question.
So I just wanted to ask, so you talk about democratic decision-making in the governance, and wanted to know how much of the representation is primarily focused on advocacy for rural health in those scenarios and advocating for that international right?
Yeah, to be honest, I don't have a great sense. What I suspect is that a lot of the lobbying and the representation is from the pharmaceutical companies, the insurance companies, et cetera. And so we don't have that voice for the individual and this right. We've cured that to some degree, in the international space through the emergence of non-governmental organizations who have become prominent actors alongside the states, alongside the multinational corporations, et cetera. And through creating a formal relationship between those entities and the United Nations. Through the Economic and Social Council, NGOs can gain consultative status where they can influence the agenda, attend meetings, right? Make arguments before those bodies. I think internationally some work has been done. Domestically, I don't think we see as much of that. And yet we do have nonprofit entities who are trying to do that. I just don't know that their voice is as heard, partly because they don't have the resources these other entities have. So it definitely is an issue. Yeah.
That was a great question. We have time for a few more questions if anyone would like to ask them. All right.
That was a great talk. And this is kind of a technical question.
Yeah.
When you were talking about the provision of essential drugs,
right?
It brought to mind essential health benefits under the ACA.
Okay.
And so I was wondering if, in their definition of essential drugs, if it includes contraception as it does under the ACA.
Yeah. So I don't remember anything in the general comment that specifically refers to that. But certainly the non-discrimination part of it and the emphasis on non-discrimination with regard to gender, and the committee and the treaty bodies generally are quite focused on sexual and reproductive health. And so if it's not in General Comment 12, there are other contexts where the treaty bodies have indicated, yes, that access to not just contraceptives, but education is part of human rights. Now, there are challenges with this because again, the rights themselves, the treaty themselves are not very detailed. And so as the committees get further and further away from the language, there are also risks that they get further and further away from the fundamentals of international law, which are obligation results from consent, et cetera. So while they've certainly taken those positions, sometimes there's certainly arguments to be made that this isn't in the treaty, and this is an interpretation maybe that's building on that arguments could be made. This is not what states have consented to at this point. But I would say definitely from the treaty body perspective, that would be included. Whether states agree that it's a legitimate reading of the treaty could be contested. Yeah.
Okay, I think this will be our last one, and then we'll let Professor Moore rest his voice before we bug him with more questions on his panel.
So as you discuss the AAAQ framework,
Right.
it's left us with a long to-do list of things to improve upon.
Absolutely.
And in with that, it also calls upon us to make some serious infrastructural changes to alleviate those. And I guess my question is, where do you think we should start?
That's an excellent question. I think one of the benefits of this framework is, as you point out, its comprehensiveness. And in that sense, I think it's a good companion to the social determinants of health lens, because I think AAQ focus a little bit more on infrastructure provision and the social determinants on the needs of the people who would access that. Just to point out that I think its breadth is helpful, but you're right, it then points out all the needs that are there to be addressed. I mean, I think one of the things that stands out to me when you look at various aspects of AAQ is the potential for things like telehealth. And it's not a cure-all, but which suggests that internet infrastructure is maybe one of the most important things that could be invested in rural areas. And I mentioned sort of the specialists at the participating in delivery or with the newborn. You know, there have been, one of the benefits of telehealth is that it can occur in non-traditional scenarios. And so there have been studies of things like telehealth in schools, right? For students who suffer from asthma or diabetes, right? And those studies have been very, very promising on the results that can be achieved where this is done in the school setting, right? Not in a clinical sort of or traditional clinical setting. And so, you know, I'm not an expert on telehealth, but it seems to me that there's a lot of potential there, so that internet access, I think, is one of the biggest things that maybe we should focus on. And I think that's generally across the globe, right? That access is not limited to health, right? It's then can be used for education. It can be used for democratic, right? For voting or for, you know, telling people about when the next city council election is. And I'm thinking sort of rural villages in Africa, et cetera. I think the potential of digital access is really profound.
Well, I would like to thank Professor Moore for spending a night in Detroit for us, you know, so. And I believe we're going to take a short break to pull up Professor Johnson back on Zoom, and then we'll be able to ask some more questions for their panel. So stick around.
Thanks. I don't need to worry about that.
Hello, how are you? Let me get logged into Zoom here. Almost. 30 more minutes? No.
How many students, how many 2L students in law review were in David's class?
Do you know? I can think of two, Amanda and Maggie.
Okay. I think Liz was in it.
Yep, she was. Thank you. I don't know why this doesn't work when I touch it, but it does for you. Gotcha. Yeah. Oh, Maggie's already coming because she's on the committee, the Symposium committee. Yeah. Professor Johnson, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Perfect. Give us about 5 minutes and we will be ready to get started. also have a printout of everything you need here, or it looks like you brought your own.
I guess we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to go ahead and take my mask off since I'm talking into the microphone for the live stream folks. There's Professor Johnson over at University of Oklahoma University? Which way to go? All right, so good afternoon. This is our second sort of panel discussion of the day, sort of focusing on the two big talks we just had from Professor Moore and Professor Johnson. You've already heard their bios, and so we'll kind of just jump into some of our questions. Professor Moore is from Brigham Young University in Provo, and Professor Johnson is from University of Oklahoma College of Law. We're very grateful to have them here and excited to hear their thoughts on international solutions to rural healthcare issues, which I think has been a really, really interesting piece of the talks that have happened this afternoon. So I'm going to start with one question, and I guess they can kind of decide how they want to answer it. But what are the benefits of utilizing international solutions, such as the avenues provided in the International Right to Health or through the J-1 visa programs that might assist in the improvement of healthcare in rural communities? And so
I could go ahead. Yeah, exactly. I could go ahead, but cut me off if you need to. So this reminds me a little bit about the question of whether we should look to laws and judgments from other countries in interpreting the Constitution. That's a little bit different, and that's a hot issue. But one of the pros of that, or arguments in favor of doing so, is that we can learn from other countries. And there is a lot of work out there on rural health issues around the world. And so I think adopting an international lens points us toward some of those, what's been done in other places. And I think we find that in lots of ways, it's not that distinct, right? That some of these solutions transfer. When you look at statistics of health statistics in rural areas of the United States, it doesn't always compare favorably to other parts of the world. And so while we think of ourselves as a large, wealthy, developed country, there are a lot of places in the United States where we're not that. And so I think there are lessons to be learned from work being done in other areas, and the international lens sort of reminds us of that.
Mm-hmm. Professor Johnson?
For me, I think the real issue is numbers. I mean, we just don't have enough trained people who want to live and work in rural communities. And this is a way to get people who want to come to the United States, who are willing to start a new life in a rural community, to provide the services that we desperately need.
Okay, so now the law school tradition of the opposite question. So what are the disadvantages of looking to some of these international solutions?
So I think part of this ties into Zach's question from after my presentation, where this can seem a little pie in the sky, you know, that international human rights is going to be helpful in solving the problems in rural West Virginia or rural areas in other parts of the United States or even other parts of the world. Partly because a lot of this is about resources, and recognizing something as a right doesn't provide resources, you know. So I think part of the answer may be looking at rights more broadly, thinking of this as part of policy and an influence on policy, as opposed to just something that is a right that's, again, judicially enforceable, et cetera. So there are limitations if we think about this just in terms of law and certainly just in terms of international human rights.
Professor Johnson?
On the immigration front, I'd say one of the questions that was raised by the audience is certainly one of the big disadvantages, which is we improve our rural healthcare by perhaps taking away providers from other countries, right? The brain drain conundrum. As I mentioned in response to that, I worry less about that, but it is a real concern. I think the bigger concern, so it's really interesting. The J-1 visa was created out of a desire to educate people about how awesome America is. It was very Cold War. It was winning hearts and minds. It had this whole idea. But if we have a process where we don't treat people well in it, we are going to alienate them. And we are not currently treating the people in our immigration system well. So people we want to come to the United States who are doing a service to our communities, we're not treating them well by giving them a timely manner in which to legitimately join our community as a permanent resident. And we have also created just so many abstract barriers in the last 5 years as a result both of crises and this intentional desire to drive down immigration. I think we can end up creating enemies out of a program that is designed to help us.
That's a really interesting insight, and sort of ties together a couple of things that both of you said about resources and how this program might work. That leads to a question about practicality. So what are the practical steps that you would have to take before you could implement the solutions that you've proposed? How could we get this off the ground?
My solutions are some of them just exist right now. There's legislation pending. We just need to get enough people to sign on to it. Some of the legislation, like the idea I have of extending the date for the SIV, no one's thought about it or talked about it, but it's fairly easy. So there are small things, or the question Hannah raised about how can we get the Indian Health Service to also become a J-1 visa sponsor. I think that those are sort of small steps that we could do. But as I said in the Q&A, I think my vision of, I also think, actually, I should also say, I think making the Conrad waiver process permanent, even expanding it, I think those are really concrete things that do really speak across aisles. That isn't a Democrat or a Republican thing, because so many different parts of the country have rural communities that need service. But real long-term solutions, I think, are elusive.
And I would say if if our effort or goal is to achieve rural health through the recognition of an international human right to health, there are extraordinary hurdles to that, right? But this sort of lesser step of learning from the international human rights framework and borrowing this AAQ lens, there it's mostly a matter of education and integrating that into our public health and health debates. And I don't want to suggest that that's not already being done, because you talk about or identifying accessibility as a problem in rural areas is sort of so obvious, right? That everyone's talking about that. But I think it's looking at rural health in a more comprehensive way, and I think that framework helps us to do that. And so it's just sort of education and integration of that perspective.
And so how would you do that in West Virginia, where we have 55 counties, many of them don't have any kind of accessibility or limited accessibility, and sort of centers around the state that do have hospitals and other clinics.
Right.
So how do you sort of bring some of those solutions into West Virginia specifically?
Yeah. So again, part of it would just be, let's use this lens to think about these things, so that we're not focused on one aspect and ignoring the others. And so that in response to this question, that we sort of we see the full plate of issues and then can conscientiously or consciously prioritize which makes sense. Again, I think a lot of the accessibility question turns on the internet and expanding internet access in the state. I think, again, not just here, but globally, I think that's one of our most promising avenues, not for achieving the right to health fully, because you can't fully replace that in-person doctor-patient or therapist-patient, or even service provider, program provider, and recipient relationship. But you can get a lot of distance with much less cost. And without having to fully solve the accessibility of personnel question, for example.
Do you think that COVID has sort of opened our eyes to some of those challenges, but also presented opportunities where you could, like, we saw like the school buses with the Wi-Fi and sort of ways that children had access to remote. Could we take some of our solutions in the pandemic for education and sort of move them to this space?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. I think the fact that Professor Johnson's participating remotely, right? This wouldn't have been done pre-COVID. We wouldn't have thought to do that, right? And so I think you're right. We've learned a lot about what's possible, even if not ideal, over the space. And the notion of the buses. Again, I mentioned a study using telehealth in the school setting, right, for child diabetes or asthma or things like this. And the results are quite promising. So I think you're right. If we look at some of the lessons we've learned of access through digital means in COVID and realize that these things can be done in settings where we didn't do it before, we can make some distance on reducing that accessibility issue.
Yeah. I think that COVID's going to introduce a lot of ways that people solve problems that we may be able to translate to other spaces, and this might be one of those. But it may be, like you mentioned earlier, that COVID has sort of highlighted for us that there are some pockets of this country that look more like other places around the world. And we have focused maybe on helping some of those places and kind of thought through some of those solutions, but haven't ever, hey, maybe we can use that solution here. Circle back to where we might need those solutions as well.
And partly, just to follow up on that, partly the way our administrative state is organized produces that, right? The U.S. Agency for International Development is not for West Virginia or North Dakota or any of these other states, right? It is for foreign countries. And the agencies that are doing domestic, right, aren't necessarily in conversation. And so we've siloed things in this massive administrative state, and some of it may be bringing issues as opposed, or addressing issues opposed to geographies.
Right, yeah. And the problems, I think, can be translated over multiple territories and places. And so maybe it's stepping back and using that lens as a way to kind of consider how we might solve some of them. So let me ask, why do you think international solutions are often not in the mix of things that people think about when they're looking specifically at rural healthcare problems? Is it part of that silo issue, or is it just this is how we've always thought of domestic problems segregated from international ones?
Yeah, I think it's a variety of things. I think part of it is the domestic international, right? Foreign policy is part of the executive's framework. Domestic is more legislatively driven. Even in the courts, right, we open up our courts more to domestic matters than we do to international matters. And so there is some of that inside-outside categorization that we've done. I think also part of it is, again, thinking we are a big, developed, wealthy country, right? And that has an exemplary, in a lot of ways, governance system. And sometimes I think, just as we've split civil and political and economic, social, and cultural into 2 treaties internationally, sometimes we prioritize some of these things and feel we're there because in the civil political space, maybe we're doing a lot better than most countries in the world, even though we still have work to do, and maybe prioritize that over some other things, or sit on our laurels because we're good there.
Interesting. Professor Johnson, did you have anything to add?
Well, I'd say we actually have thought quite a bit about physicians in rural healthcare places because of the J1 waiver system that we have in place. What we haven't thought about as much is the issue that Hannah brought up at the very beginning of the day, which is mid-level practitioners, right? What are we doing to bring nurse practitioners, nurses, CMAs, PTs, every other kind, dentists? Oh my Lord, the difficulty in finding a dentist in North Dakota, I can't even begin to tell you. We haven't done a lot with those other fields, and I think it's just needing to raise awareness about that.
So if you could build from the ground up and design an ideal international system that would sort of solve some of the rural healthcare issues, what would that look like?
I like my idea of a W visa. So I would start with the non-immigrant visa. I think it is sort of our tradition in bringing in professionals, that we have them come to the United States for a short time as a temporary worker, see if they like it, and then give them the opportunity to convert to lawful permanent residence thereafter. So that would be my proposal, is a new visa to that would be committed solely to medical professionals, however broadly we wanted to define that, willing to serve in an underserved area, recognizing, as also they talked about in the earlier parts of today, that an underserved area may be a segment of an urban area. There are urban underserved areas, but I think keeping the language that the government uses just brings in more partners in terms of politicians who would agree to this concept, because it would apply broadly, and allow people to come and give them a concrete, hassle-free pathway to lawful permanent residence, which is itself a pathway to U.S. citizenship. But that is my pie in the sky solution.
And if I can give contrary answers, just like there be contrary questions. So, if we look at this from an international perspective, following up on Professor Johnson's, I have real concerns about that because of the brain drain, et cetera. I mean, there are the sort of civil political rights, right to movement, et cetera. But those rights are really only going to be accessible to certain people, people who can get medical education, for example, in other countries. And so I do really worry about the fairness of this and the need to think about achieving healthcare globally. And again, on the one hand, it is in our interest to have more providers come to the United States. On the other hand, if there is that brain drain and we leave countries without adequate health care, then we're likely to face the consequences of that through diseases that spread, right? It's like COVID, or it's Ebola, or it's some sort of avian influenza or something. And so I'm not entirely sure it's even in our best interest to draw so many to the United States. So when I look at it internationally, I think I have some concerns with that. And then I'm not sure the international framework is the best. You get, again, some of the ideas, the studies, et cetera, are very helpful and transfer across the globe. But I think the solution, the on-the-ground work, is likely to be better to be done as locally as possible. And so, when we look at development, my years in international development, there's a real push at localization, because often this international development work is done by the Beltway bandits, right? These big companies or NGOs that get a lot of money from the government and go out and do this work. And we don't build up the local ability and infrastructure. And so my contrary answer is that while the international perspective can help, while we can learn, a lot of this really needs to be done at a local level, because in that process you do build up capacity, community buy-in, et cetera. That's part of the long-term solution.
How can lawyers inspire that work?
That's a good question. One of the things I've really struggled with.
Law students, I suppose.
Yeah.
Law students and lawyers.
Let me say, I think that's a really difficult question. So I went to USAID. I wanted to get involved in international development as a legal scholar. And there isn't a lot of law and development out there. It's not taught in our law schools. There's scholarship on it in the rule of law sort of area, but when you talk about public health or education, et cetera, I've really struggled to answer the question, what's the value that lawyers add in that discussion? We don't have the quantitative skills, for example, right, to do the studies to see what's going to be produce the best development impact. And so I don't know the answer to that, except one part of the answer may be that law is really a leadership degree. It's a problem-solving degree, and these are really tricky problems. And so I think bringing to bear the leadership skills that law teaches and the problem-solving, the analytical skills that law provides or legal education provides, I think, is somewhere we can contribute.
I think also running for local office.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Sort of being in the legislature at the state level.
Yeah.
Being involved in your municipality and sort of dictating what the health policy decisions are in those areas.
Yeah.
I think those are great things that lawyers can be involved with, even if your day-to-day practice involves something else,
Something
because
very
your
different.
day-to-day practice will touch on the healthcare policy in many ways, and we see that with poverty and opioid addiction. It's a big problem in West Virginia, as it is a big problem in many other states. But that's where I think lawyers maybe have become disengaged from that a little bit, and I think that is where lawyers need to come in and play an important role in those communities. That's my 2 cents.
I agree.
Yeah.
I would just also add that law students, to the extent they're in the room, should really take legislation. I really try to emphasize that you can often get more accomplished through legislative change than you can through suing. And all it takes is a good idea and pitching it to people and getting them to like it. And it's, I think, an under-thought of aspect of our legal system.
I would
much agree.
definitely echo that. Yeah, I'm clapping because
definitely.
it ties into my presentation that our reflex is going to the courts, but law happens in lots of other fora, and the legislature is a powerful place for lawyers to have an influence.
Yeah, as are state agencies and federal agencies
Yeah.
that are creating some of these guidelines for some of the places. I think we are at the end of our journey to refreshments. So I want to thank Professor Johnson for joining us remotely. I'm sorry that you won't get any refreshments. And Professor Moore for joining us in person. And I believe we now adjourn to the event hall. You got other announcements? Excellent.
Quick announcements.
Sure. I'll let you have this.
Real quickly, I just have a few remarks. I know we have said thank you so many times today, but I'm going to say it again. We cannot express how grateful we are to our presenters. All of you who presented today have done a lovely job, and we are so grateful. To our moderators, Dean Reinhardt and Dan Kimball, wonderful jobs done as well. To the students who I've had running all over this school and all over this state to get people here, we appreciate you too. Our staff members, Lisa Brunoli, who got the food here, Ken, who has been our technology superman. We couldn't do this without him. We are so, so thankful. And I just want to go ahead and throw out as well, we will kick off tomorrow at 8 with another light breakfast, and then we'll be back in here at 9. We've got some lovely speeches and presentations. Professor Buck, Professor Farringer, Professor Fox, and I think Professor Blake and her colleague Nathan Hamans. All are going to have lovely talks. So I hope everyone either comes back in person or through the live stream. And we will see you tomorrow. To our speakers, hang out for a minute so I can make sure I either get you to the hotel, dinner, and or both on time. All right, thank you, guys. Thank you so much.